Welcome everybody to the Canon panel spotlighting the film. My name is Pauli Murray. I'm Pat Thompson, a writer for American Cinematographer, and I'm pleased to introduce the panelists. We have, first of all, the co-director Julie Cohen, who made this film with Betsy West. They were last at Sundance in 2018 with RBG. And we also have Claudia Raschke, who also DP'd on RBG. And we have the editor, Cinque Northern, who also has a writing credit on this film. So let's begin with you, Julie. And for those who haven't seen the film, what was your elevator pitch?
Oh, no, I don't know. We don't pitch in elevators unless you're going like up a skyscraper. I don't know. But basically, this is the story of probably the most monumental and magnificent civil rights and women's rights activists that most Americans have not heard of. Pauli Murray played a pivotal role in coming up with some of the key ideas behind the legal strategies, both of the civil rights movement and of the women's rights movement. Pauli was a lawyer, an activist, an accomplished and published poet, and also later in life was ordained an Episcopal priest. Just a monumental person with ideas so far, so many years and decades ahead of the times that when you hear Pauli's story, you're going to say, holy crap, I can't believe I didn't learn about this person in school.
And Ruth Bader Ginsberg introduced or led you to her. And how did that happen? What did she say?
Yes, well, it was through looking into RBG's story that Betsy and I learned about Pauli Murray, because when RBG wrote her first brief as a lawyer that she submitted to the Supreme Court in 1971, arguing that women should be equal to men under the US Constitution because of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, RBG credited that idea on the written brief to Pauli Murray. Like, that name, Pauli Murray, is on the cover of the brief along with RBG's name. And, quite an unusual thing to do, because Pauli Murray actually didn't work specifically on that case. It was the fact that Pauli had developed this idea some years before, both in a legal case that didn't go to the Supreme Court, but was in federal court, and also in an influential law review article. And RBG just decided, there are some others didn't always credit Pauli Murray's work, but RBG, who had been in positions of not being credited for work that RBG had done, thought, no, Pauli Murray developed this idea, and I'm going to put Pauli's name right on the cover of the brief.
So she just mentioned this in passing.
Yes. I mean, we actually saw it there on the brief, and it just kind of came up in our research about the development of the idea of the 14th Amendment as an instrument of women's rights. Yeah. It'd been used as an instrument of rights for racial equality, but the expansion of that concept for women's rights was a Pauli Murray idea that found its way into the Supreme Court via Ruth Bader Ginsberg.
Right. And let's pivot to the camera team. Julie, was it a no-brainer to hire Claudia again? Puffball question, because she worked on RBG as well.
That one's a short answer. Yes, no-brainer.
So Claudia, you supervised a team of 6 camera operators, plus 5 more on additional photography. So what were your needs and goals?
Well, for Pauli Murray, the strategy was based on, we knew we had a lot of archival footage that was going to be integrated in the storytelling. And part of when you don't know yet as a cinematographer what type of archival footage you're going to be using, is it going to be black and white? How deteriorated might it be? Is it video based? Is it photography based? Are there documents that are going to be used? What type is it all? Is it colorized? Does it have any kind of color in it? You're faced with a collage of different, elements. The whites, the blacks, the colors, the framing, the composition. And because it becomes a collage, and a collage of her life as a cinematographer, and with Betsy and Julie, we felt that not yet knowing where we're going to land and where our main focus will be with the archival material of how it will all come together, it is wise to give each person who will be interviewed, or each little verite scene, to make it wholesome by embracing that particular time and location. So often our locations were the inspiration to set up the lighting, set up the framing, incorporate what was happening there, to really create a environment for the audience to listen to, as well as to feel that they can identify with. At times it were home settings, at times it was natural lighting, at times it was in the archives themselves. And so setting that up allowed us to use them as standalone elements that can be placed anywhere in the film. And the joy of it is, of course, that when you have the edited film and me as a cinematographer then see how it all comes together, then the fine tuning really happens of how do you go into the post-production of doing your color correct? How do you create a bite on that archival footage that represents, Pauli's activism, at times her sense of writing and reflection and inner thought? How do you back off? So there's a lot of play and sculpting that happens, therefore, in the post time. But with the cinematographers that we had, that contributed to the film and operated second camera, that was all under that umbrella, where we were sharing either a screen grab from a previous interview, and obviously with conversations that I would have to explain what our intent was.
So did you operate camera A?
Most of the time I did, yes.
So to keep things consistent, did you have your team share or have the same camera package and lens?
Absolutely. I believe in trying to stay true to the ability of the sensor to recreate the highlights and the rich blacks, as well as the color rendition. So having a camera that is consistent throughout the filmmaking process allows that to happen. So I know how my sensor on the Canon cameras that I used, which was Canon 300 Mark II, that sensor for me is my canvas. I know how to use lighting and how color is being performs under certain circumstances. And so I like that very much. In addition, when we were shooting RBG, we really fell in love with the prime lenses that they have. And so for our interviews, deciding to work with the cinema primes, the Canon cinema primes at pretty much a T2 or a T2.5 allowed us to create that kind of soft, out of focus and shallow depth of field for the background that really kind of chisels out the subjects that we're interviewing.
Thanks. So let's move to the archives. There was quite a treasure, to say the least. And after a brief introduction, the film essentially starts with Murray's death in 1985, and it shows the vast, enormous archive that she left behind, which is now at Harvard. And so the film is threaded through with two key elements. One is the interview in black and white on film. And the second is this audio recording that she did of her autobiography, for whatever reason, I would like to know. So Julie, what can you tell us about these two elements, these two finds?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a little bit about the finds. In terms of the threading, I think that's also a Sinkway question. I mean, the gift of the audio, which was not only the autobiography, but also a number of other audio interviews of Pauli that are woven throughout, was basically what allowed us to take a story of someone who, after all, died in 1985 and create a film that feels like it has some immediacy to it. And it's a good question. Why is it before the era of books on tape that there was an audio of Pauli Murray's great autobiography, Song and Weary Throat? There's a very specific answer. Close friend of Pauli's, someone that had been a professor when Pauli was in graduate school, was someone that Pauli turned to for guidance on many things. Her name was Caroline Ware. She's actually not a character in our film. She died quite some time ago. She was going blind towards the end of Pauli's life, and Pauli wanted guidance on the autobiography. So got a tape recorder and just would record every chapter, put it in the mail, and send it to Caroline Ware. This was actually not in Pauli Murray's archive. But Caroline Ware had taken it to another archive. So when our one of our great PAs, Amira Williams, went looking for photographs in an archive that she had seen credited, she said, "Hey, anything else of Pauli Murray's that you have?" And they're like, "Well, we do have these 30, this box of 30 tapes that are the reading of Pauli's autobiography." So fortunately, we were able to give Sinkway not only Claudia's beautiful modern day shooting, but a pretty, I don't know how it compares to other archival stuff you've done, Sinkway, but we felt like we had a pretty substantial, hefty group of materials to build the film from.
So that audio recording was essentially a rough draft?
Yes.
And what was the TV interview, if it was for TV?
It was not for TV. It was for a project that a young student, graduate student named Lynn Conroy had done in 1979. It was part of a program to develop feminist curricula. And when she finished the interview, she was young, as you can she sort of pops on tape occasionally. She was quite young, but like when she came to the end, she was like, "Wow, that person was really amazing. Like I should do something with this footage that I have." And she actually brought it to Harvard. It ended up in the same library, but not in Pauli Murray's collection. So again, we came across that. It was on VHS tape. It had never been digitized before our project. And the people at Harvard Schlesinger Library were good enough to digitize it. And we all looked at it and said, "This is pretty amazing." And it also has Pauli's adorable dog, Roy, in it, making Roy become a character in the film.
I love Roy. So Sinkway, what kind of visual material, usable visual material, was in Pauli's archive?
There was quite a bit. I think where the challenge would come in was sometimes the material wasn't as experiential as I would have liked. So sometimes we would request things. So in other words, it was sometimes portrait-like, or, it had a staged look. So I requested a lot of archival to sort of set a stage to make it feel like you're seeing the world through Pauli's eyes, as opposed to looking at Pauli or an image of Pauli while Pauli recounts something, but to actually think about, okay, Pauli's telling this story. What would they have seen? What would the environment be? And then requesting a lot of archival to make you feel like you're in a present moment, and then interweave that with the actual archival. So it was a combination. We had quite a bit, but the challenge was, how do you make people feel like they're really there?
Yeah. It's always the case with archives.
Yeah.
And Julie, how many archive researchers did you hire? And did Harvard have Pauli's archives in pretty good shape, i.e. cataloged?
Yes, they had it quite well cataloged, including online, so that Talea Bridges McMahon, our producer, was able pretty quickly to get a pretty good handle on what was there. And then Talea and Betsy and I, and at various times, were actually at the library, going through some of the stuff. But there was only one person whose dedicated job was being an archival researcher. That was Claudia Lopez. Mm-hmm. But going through the archive was work that all of us did. Sinkway looked at quite a bit of stuff. Myself and Betsy looked at quite a lot of stuff. Talea looked at a lot. So it really wasn't just Claudia's job. I mean, that's kind of the fun of it, like all of Pauli's letters. I mean, once we got the batch of photos, which, as Sinkway says, were, while they were cool, sort of tended towards the portrait, like, okay, so this is a nice picture of Pauli's face, but how is he going to make it feel like, oh, you're going into a home and being amidst books and all kinds of different scenes. But like, when we got, stills are pretty easy. There were like 800 images of that in there. Not all of them were of Pauli. Some of them were actually taken by Pauli. Not all of them were we exactly sure what they were. But I feel like we all looked through almost all of them, because it's pretty easy to click through and start looking for what are cool, the cool images.
And how many other archives did you have to tap?
Oh, people always ask questions like this, and we don't in advance. I mean, if you look at our credits, there's a lot. If you count even an archive that we just got 1 or 2 images from, I'm sure there are more than 30. But I can't give you an exact number. And I will say the vast majority of the material did come from a few great archives. Schlesinger at Harvard had quite a bit. There's an archive at Howard University that had a fair amount of not so much Pauli specific, but kind of Pauli adjacent material. The National Park Service library in archive in Maryland, from which the Pauli recording of the autobiography came from, those were 3 major ones.
So Sinkway, did you get involved at the start? And how did you wrap your head around all of this information?
We pretty much, the short answer is we pretty much went scene by scene. And yeah, I was involved from the start. And they actually came to me early on, maybe Julie, before you even had some of the archival. But the one thing I kept hearing, I heard from you, Talea, and Betsy, was like, we have this great audio, and there are these great stories, and there are no images of the stories that Pauli is telling. Like, how do we create, a visual kind of scene? So that was the challenge early on. But that actually ended up, for me, being the fun part, is just trying to figure out what would Pauli be seeing? Like, that was just kind of the mantra. What kind of details, and then the more specific, the better. It's not always literally what Pauli's saying, but where is Pauli, and what would you see if you were there? Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I would like you and Julie both to talk about finding the right balance between Pauli's personal life and her professional life, because the film toggles back and forth between the two, and one has great bearing on the other. So how did you find this balance?
It's a really good question. And there's not the main answer is, I think, a lot of back and forth. We would watch, both looking at the material and thinking about it, but then as Sinkway would edit scenes and edit cuts, I think we would all watch and see how it was feeling. I will say that often when you're a viewer of a complex story, personal stuff really stands out. And I kind of feel, Sinkway, tell me if you think this is true, I kind of feel like for, you and me and Betsy and Talea, like what we all gravitated towards the personal story as finding it kind of immediately engaging as we were putting stuff together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And sometimes things that would seem like they wouldn't be as personal or emotional, once they got cut, ended up a lot more emotional. Like some of the things like Pauli's breakups and heartbreaks, like we knew would be emotional. But then other things it may surprise you when it's laid out, how much weight it might have on the next scene and the scene that comes after.
Can you give a for instance? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I'll give an example of a maybe unexpectedly emotional scene, which is sort of going from the time that, or early in the Depression, Pauli had just graduated from Hunter College, couldn't get a job because, nobody was going to have good luck getting a job in the early 30s. Certainly a young Black woman was not going to be an easy, was not going to be easy to get hired. And Pauli, having trouble getting enough to eat even, decides to go ride the rails, as a lot of young unemployed people do. And Sinkway created a scene from a few or even just one incredible photo?
One, maybe two. I think it's just one.
From one incredible photo of Pauli climbing up a train, combined with so much archive, beautiful music coming, some of the photos that of Pauli not on a train, and then woven with interviews that Claudia had shot that may seem like they're way out of the vibe of this scene, but isn't. But like to go from starving Pauli to like the freedom and joy of riding the rails Pauli, to me feels, and I think our execs kind of responded the same, like they felt like the film just really comes alive in that moment. It feels like and you're hearing this audio description from Pauli of what it was like to ride the rails.
Yeah, and that scene barely changed from the first cut. There's always a scene like that, and then there's always a scene you just cut from the beginning of the experience till the end. But that riding the rail scene, it changed very little from the first time.
Yes, and it was one of the very first things you did.
I love the fact that she did that. It took courage.
Yeah.
So the film exposes a lot of precedents that Pauli set. And let's talk about one of those. In 1940, 15 years before Rosa Parks, there was the Petersburg Bus Incident. And you position that near the top of the film, somewhat out of sequence. So tell us about this event and why you decided to lead with this story.
Yeah. We just felt that the very fact of it, we sort of start with a graphic that points out that, we're putting you in 1940, 15 years before the obviously much more well-known incident of Rosa Parks getting arrested for sitting in the quote unquote wrong section of a bus. Pauli described it very well on tape. It seemed like a concrete example. A lot of Pauli's great accomplishment were kind of legal thinking accomplishments, but like it's hard to grasp a legal thinking thing, whereas an activism moment you sort of get. And we did have the thought that would be an important scene. So when we were at the Schlesinger Library with Claudia, she was shooting not only an interview of Pauli's grandniece talking about this story, but also the grandniece going through all kinds of files at the archive. And one of the folders that we particularly had her look through was that one, the Petersburg Bus Incident, to sort of, help put Sinkway in a position to like create a bridge between present day woman looking back on a relative's accomplishments and then to sort of shoot you into history.
So let's break this scene down a bit, because this was one of the cases that you had an event without a camera present. So talk about the components. You said the interview was with Pauli's grandniece?
Correct.
With a friend's grandniece.
There were two people in that scene. Yes, there's the woman who's at the archives looking through the folder is Pauli's grandniece, learning more about, learning more about this amazing relative who she had known in real life, but hadn't really understood the import of. The other person in the scene is a woman named Margaretta McBean, whose mom had actually been with Pauli Murray and had gotten arrested on the bus. We actually met Margaretta at an event commemorating Pauli Murray at the Schomburg Center.
I was wondering how you found her.
Margaretta was not, she was not a participant in the event. She was in the audience, and she got up at the end to ask a question of the people who were speaking at the event. And we were like, wow, who is this cool woman? She's quite a character, as I think you can even tell from her short appearance in the film. And we just went over to her and started talking. She was just starting to learn the full story of Pauli Murray, someone that her mom had told her all about, but she hadn't really been sure if the stories were true until some of the scholarship has come out more recently on Pauli.
So Sinkway, talk about the visuals you had to work with. You actually had the NAACP court documents, which you built on in part, but you needed much, much more to build the sequence. So what did you look for? And how do you construct it?
Yeah, sure. Well, pretty early on, I think, Julie, we had that bus, that sort of promotional Greyhound bus video that can actually put you on a Greyhound bus, take you through a rural area. So that kind of was the basis for Pauli's bus ride. And again, just showing details that people Pauli might have seen. A sense of placing you in that era was really important. So, and this was kind of throughout, but definitely here, is keeping the audience from looking at it through today's eyes and letting them really go back in time. So whenever we tell a story, you remember, you get a sense of the time you're in and the place you're in. So that archival, a lot of it was the bus material was from a single kind of video. And then what else is in? We had Claudia just pulled some really great.
You had the jail scenes. Scenes.
And we went through a variety of jail scenes because this was rural South. So sometimes we got these archivals that it was too big of a prison. We needed something small from that time. A lot of photos in that one, and then also just using the archival not just as a document to look at, but just as part of the scenery. Layering the documents to keep this idea going of like there's a stack of archivals that the whole film is going through. So using the documents rhythmically with the music and also piling them on top of each other. And a lot of these documents didn't fill up a frame horizontally, so you kind of, as well as the photos, so you kind of had to layer things to create a full, so that the frame wasn't vertical.
There were a fair number of photojournalists in that era taking photos of segregated buses, even while protests against the Jim Crow South weren't succeeding. It was a subject of interest to photojournalists. So there are a couple really, really nice images in that scene. It's not the literal bus that Pauli's on, but just giving you a sense of a segregated bus in the South in that era. And when you see a good image married with Claudia's much more modern shooting of the two current day characters, who are both, as it happens, like a little bit colorfully dressed and made up. So it's sort of like really a contrast from the black and white. Obviously, Claudia didn't quite know when she was shooting what what she was going for. But then, and then with archival sound of Pauli describing, just describing how painful it was to be in that situation, and what led to a decision to not be where she was legally required to be on that bus.
And Claudia, you also shot interviews with some scholars for this section. And can you say a word about that?
As Julie said, when we embarked on this journey of setting up for the different interviews, not knowing exactly of where it would fall within the edit and the timeline of the story, you are somewhat just trying to make it a standalone piece rather than trying to match it. And you hope that in post that you can find a transition that either emphasizes a lead up or into, these interviews. But I think part of what her granddaughter that setup worked so well, because besides the interview, we also had the time with her to go through the archive and explore and really give a sense of that there is a place where this incredible information is being kept, that there is an access to history that nobody knows about, and it is like this hidden secret, that there are these incredible archives around the world that hold these treasures, right? And so for me, it was very important to have that wraparound for that character, to really get the attention to the story that they were telling, or that especially her granddaughter was great-granddaughter was telling.
And with some of our experts as well, Claudia also shot not only the interviews, but scenes of them teaching people about Pauli Murray to help.
Yeah, exactly, to create kind of the awareness of where they are in terms of space and time, in terms of the timeline. But again, I have to say that every time you see a location and you are looking at and being motivated by that location of how you can possibly set up, there are reoccurring themes. And I think part of what I am very happy about in these interviews is that you have the influence of a window, and a window to the world is also a window to a world in history. And so there is, for my own, thinking, I find that there is a connection with the light coming from the window, illuminating somebody who is sitting there and shining themselves a light on a story in history. So it kind of works with a theme, and we have that reoccurring in all of the interviews, that there's always an influence of a window and natural lighting pouring in.
So I want to move to the Roosevelts. Pauli blasted out numerous letters of protest to FDR in what she called confrontation by typewriter. And she smartly CC'd Eleanor Roosevelt on all of this correspondence. And Eleanor became a good friend and a surrogate mother. And Julie, I was wondering, did this have any trickle-down effect on FDR and his policies?
Oh, I think it did. I mean, I think like a lot of politicians of every era are hugely influenced by their wives, indirectly, but also in the case of FDR and Eleanor, quite directly, as people, Eleanor was lobbying for all kinds of policy things throughout FDR's time in the White House, and I'm sure before and after. And Pauli had the good strategic sense that, of course, in this day and age, it's almost hard to imagine like just a citizen writing a letter to the president and first lady and getting like this very direct, like sort of thought through response from the first lady. I almost kind of can't imagine that happening now. But but it did happen. Pauli thought correctly, like, well, you know, FDR might be busy, but maybe Eleanor, you know, who seems like she's paying a lot of attention to public engagement, and in fact was quite involved herself in civil rights activism, if not exactly the most progressive thinking person by today's standards, certainly. Our consulting producer for this film, Patricia Bell Scott, actually wrote a book about the relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Pauli Murray, and that goes into some detail on this interesting connection. And it just seemed like another thing about Pauli Murray that was fascinating.
So, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt appointed Pauli to a women's commission in which she chaired, started by JFK. And through that, Pauli met Betty Friedan and was among the 28 founding members of NOW. And after that, she pioneered the legal argument about the 14th Amendment that you were talking about earlier on. So did she personally know Ginsberg before she recommended her to the ACLU board?
Yes, she did. Yes, the two knew one another. They actually had met when Pauli, as we mentioned in the film, that Pauli was an associate at the esteemed New York law firm Paul Weiss, Rifkin and Garrison. RBG, which we don't mention in the film, was actually a summer associate there and met Pauli. RBG was not given a full-time job there, and her understanding was that because Pauli was already hired, so the thought was like, well, we've already got a woman, so like we couldn't hire another. In any case, so they had met then, and actually Pauli had given RBG a memoir Pauli had written called Proud Shoes, an incredible historical family history, and RBG is a big reader and was very impressed by that book. Pauli kept up with the work that RBG was starting to do, fighting for women's rights through the New Jersey Civil Liberties Union, and later, and that's what got her thinking. That's what sparked the idea that RBG could serve on the board of the ACLU, forwarding women's rights at a time when the ACLU was really not so interested in women's rights.
Yeah, and we know from your film how important that move was, the RGB.
Absolutely.
So tell us about the case that Pauli calls her sweetest victory and what bearing that has on Ginsberg's later case in 1971.
Yeah, so that was the case called Crook versus White, where it was on an issue that was quite alive in the courts at that time about whether states could exclude women from jurors and also Black jurors. There was both in practice that there were all white juries, although the law didn't permit you to just say, I'm striking this juror because of race, but that is what would happen in reality. The law in a lot of states did let you say, like, no, we don't, like, no women on the juries. So Pauli and colleagues at the ACLU took a case that actually dealt with both issues, and whereas a number of her colleagues were advancing this argument on that a jury had to be racially equitable, Pauli also argued that women should be on the jury, and that you could use the exact same provision of the Constitution to make the argument, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Pauli made that argument in a court brief. The U.S. District Court that served Alabama ruled in favor of Pauli and said that the 14th Amendment prohibits sex discrimination. But that didn't become the law of the land because everyone was afraid to challenge that to the Supreme Court, because what if, God forbid, the Supreme Court should also decide that women had rights under the 14th Amendment. So it was an argument that RBG picked up several years later, quite successfully, which is what led her to credit Pauli Murray.
So we need to talk about the love of Pauli Murray's life, who was Renee Barlow, the office manager at this law firm you just mentioned. And Sinkway, how much visual material did you have of Rennie? Like that much?
you already know the answer to that, don't you? If as many times as I said to Julie, is this Pauli and Rennie? Like there were these photos of Pauli and someone who might look like Rennie. There are no photos of the two of them. So those photos in the film are all the photos of Rennie, and none of them are in. Only one is in that grid. There's that
You're
great.
cutting out.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
There's that great photo of Rennie surrounded by men at the law firm, which is a great photo to identify her by. But other than that, they're just basically portraits and nothing with Pauli, definitely nothing to show them, connected in any way at all. So I think, the letters and just the way they had nicknames for each other ended up being really the most intimate. It was what made you like them, as a couple. I'm surprised that hasn't happened to me yet. But yeah, we had very little. So it's just those letters were like a treasure trove, and the way they had nicknames for each other. That's really what.
I wanted to ask you about that because it was so sweet the way you handled it. So that was just, use by deprivation. You needed that because you didn't have visuals?
In particular, the scene with the letters?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that pretty much, and I have to give credit to the associate editor, Hillary Crow. I think, Julie, you guys kind of put that together, and she kind of did a rough of it that I love so much that I honestly just did very little to it, except just cut it to the music.
You had better luck with Peggy's, her first love.
Yeah, those images were amazing. Like that's the gold mine when you see Pauli that informal and just in her space doing whatever. That was a gold mine. And we looked really hard for other images of Rennie.
So all of you, I want to do a round. And what was your biggest challenge, your biggest challenges in your respective roles?
Want to start? I would say that the biggest overall challenge just in plunging in and deciding like, okay, we're gonna make a feature doc that's gonna tell the story of someone who most of our audience isn't going to be familiar with, who died 35 years ago and of whom there's not very much videotape. And we, the decision to make this as a feature film came from the fact of how much audio there was. And I just think that's why, as Sinkway says, we emphasize that so much when we first reached out to him, because we were like, we're going to have to figure out how to build this story and not be afraid and not stay away from the audio. Like, we didn't want it to be just the interviews. We wanted Pauli's voice to be central to the film. I feel like there was like pretty close to 100% agreement between all creative people on the film that we wanted, that we really wanted Pauli's voice to be central. So that was sort of the psychological challenge from the director's perspective that we then just like shift over to the editor. Like, okay, here's a monumental problem. See what, like, how can we, like, can we do this?
And at what point, how early did you find this audio recording?
Well, as I say, there were actually, although it might feel seamlessly like one audio recording, there are many, many audio recordings in the film. The first one, there was one that was actually online, not even through the Harvard Library, but through a different source. That's like a 5.5-hour interview that was quite good. And finding that audio tape is what made us say, like, oh, I think we could do a film about this person. So we had that, and we actually didn't really make a decision to pursue this as a documentary feature aggressively until we were aware that the audio library was pretty extensive. The video we found later.
And Claudia?
Yeah, I've been trying to think what was my biggest challenge. You know, the when you're shooting a setup for an interview or trying to integrate cinema verite with the character, it flows pretty organically. I think my biggest challenge for this film is really the color correction afterwards. Of where you have to really pay close attention of how you're going to correct the color to lead into the black and white or the sepia tones, or what level of contrast you're going to emphasize. When are you daring to crush the blacks? All of that needs to sing along with the story and be sensitive enough that it doesn't take over, and so that Pauli will be present and still vibrant. And I think sometimes what happens, and that is so fascinating to me, that every person has a different type of tracking of color. So if you are engaged in a color image, and then you go to black and white, for the first few frames, you actually are still memorizing that color before you go into the black and white. Then it neutralizes all of your, the visual imprint in your mind. And then when you come out of black and white into a color picture again, the colors become incredibly vibrant. So that when you go, for instance, often in color correction, because of the amount of time you want to spend on how efficient you want to be and whatever else is scheduled to get accomplished during that session, sometimes it's easy to just go, okay, we have 12 interviews, let's just grab a frame, color correct it, and then move on to the next interview. But what happens is that you are missing out on that time where you float from one to the black and white, and from the black and white, or whatever else it is, from the document back into the interview. And that is kind of a finessing that I find is a real challenge. And when you have a really good colorist, we are with Ken Zierski at Goldcrest. He is super talented. And so, we work in tandem of making those transitions happen. And but that I would say is the biggest challenge for this film for me.
And Sinkway?
I would say connectivity and momentum. Because Pauli had so many different chapters. This is someone that was a lawyer and a priest, and and to not make the life feel like a series of accounts, but to let each scene flow into the other, where you feel like the scene you're seeing is a result of the scene you saw before, and that you're actually building, which is like Pauli's life took so many turns that to not to not let it just be a series of accounts, but an emotional experience where you're not feeling that you've transitioned into another scene, because it makes sense to go there. And Pauli did so many things that it's hard we had this problem of just like, we cut out, I mean, it's cliche, but we cut out a lot of amazing things that Pauli did. And that was, but it needed breath. It needed to breathe so that things that were in there could actually land. So there were times, for a long time, it just felt so dense to me. And just trying to, it's part of the process, but just pulling things back until things were flowing together. We all lost babies in that room between, I think each of us lost a baby or two that we, something that we thought was precious.
So I think we're out of
we were
time.
all pretty in unison in that goal of trying to make that the important thing is that the whole thing flows and feels like you're into a story. And the fact that we are leaving, I mean, we could do a whole other show on every chapter of Pauli's life that is not included in this film. There is a lot of but I think like making it a story that felt like a story was a big goal for all of us.
Well, she had a truly amazing life. And thank you for this film and for introducing all of us to Pauli Murray, whose name we now know. So thank you all and have a good Sundance.
Thank you
Thank
so much,
you.
Pat.
Bye.
Thank you, Pat.